All right, today we are diving into a pretty provocative piece of writing. It lays out an argument for nothing less than a full blown revolution in Western countries. Now, just to be clear, our job here isn't to agree or disagree. We're simply going to break down the arguments piece by piece to really understand the logic that leads to such a radical idea. So let's get into it.
Right off the bat, the source material does not mince words. This is its central thesis. It's framing the whole discussion around the idea that the systems we have now aren't just a little broken, but are actually beyond repair, and that the only option left on the table is something drastic. So you have to ask, how in the world does someone get to that conclusion? Well, the document tries to build its case on a few key critiques, really aiming at the foundations of the modern state. We're going to walk through each one of these pillars and look at the evidence the source uses to back up its claims.
Okay, first up, the economy. The source's argument begins with the claim that the financial structures that hold up Western nations are, to put it bluntly, completely and permanently broken. And it starts with maybe the biggest, scariest number of them all, the national debt.
That is about as absolute a statement as you can make. The document argues there's just no realistic way the principal on these huge national debts will ever get paid back. It doesn't treat this as a maybe, but as a mathematical certainty. And to show you what it means, it uses a pretty powerful thought experiment.
So what's with the 7 years? Well, according to this source, if the US government just stopped everything, I mean, no military, no social security, no road repairs, absolutely nothing, and it took every single penny of tax revenue and threw it at the national debt, it would still take 7 years just to pay off the principal. And get this, that's not even counting the interest that piles up. The point the source is trying to make here is that this debt is, for all practical purposes, permanent.
Okay, so after looking at debt, the document flips to the other side of the balance sheet, the money coming in. It argues that the way we collect taxes has become so ridiculously complicated that it doesn't even work fairly or efficiently anymore. And this is where it gets kind of wild. Take a look at these numbers. The actual US tax code itself is almost 7,000 pages long, which is already a lot. But then, when you tack on all the related IRS rules and official explanations, it explodes to 75,000 pages. The source claims this insane complexity is the whole problem. It creates endless loopholes and makes the system impossible for a normal person to understand, but a total playground for anyone who can afford an army of lawyers and accountants. So after the economy, the argument shifts gears and looks at the actual machinery of government. The claim here is that the very institutions that are supposed to serve the public have just become stiff and ineffective. The word the document keeps using is sclerosis. And yeah, it's basically what it sounds like from biology, a hardening. It's describing institutions that have become so wrapped up in red tape and regulations that they're slow, clunky, and basically unable to change or reform in any meaningful way. Now, from that broad idea of bureaucracy, the source zooms in on one of the most important functions of any state, the justice system. And its assessment is pretty grim. It basically describes it as completely broken, failing its core mission of providing equal justice for everybody. The source really breaks this down into a list of failures. It claims there's a two-tiered system, where how much money you have determines your outcome. It points out how incredibly expensive and time-consuming it is to get anything done. It talks about judges handing out arbitrary sentences, and it argues that the rich and powerful often manage to avoid any real consequences. And finally, it even critiques prison itself, calling it a super expensive and ineffective way to deal with crime. And this brings us to what's probably the most fundamental challenge in the entire document. After going after the economy and the government's machinery, the source takes direct aim at the political system that's supposed to run it all, universal suffrage democracy. To try and prove its point that democracy doesn't actually deliver what voters want, the document gives two examples. First, it points to Australia's 2010 election, where it says both main parties promised to end the Big Australia high immigration policy. But according to the source, that policy just kept on going no matter who won. Then it looks at Brexit in the UK, framing it as a clear vote to take back control, but arguing that the political establishment essentially fumbled the whole thing and didn't achieve the main goals. The document then boils its whole critique down to what it sees as three core problems. First, there's no real accountability. Politicians who make bad decisions often just move on to cushy jobs later. Second, it says the system lets politicians win by essentially bribing the majority of voters with programs and benefits that are paid for by the taxes of a minority. And third, it argues that election cycles force politicians to either think in the very short term to win the next vote, or, if the term is long, allows bad governments to stick around for way too long.
So you might be wondering, what's the thread that ties all these different failures together? Well, the source's final argument is that the root cause for all of it is something that's just built into the state itself: corruption. Now, this is a really crucial distinction. The document isn't talking about corruption as a few bad apples or moral failures. Instead, it argues that corruption is a systemic feature, that it's basically guaranteed to happen, and it grows in direct proportion to how big, rich, and powerful a government gets. The bigger the state, the more corruption is just baked right into the system. And to really drive this point home, the document draws a straight line between the corruption of ancient imperial Rome and what it sees in modern Western capitals. It claims the fundamental behavior is exactly the same. The only things that have changed, it argues, are the sheer amount of money involved and what it calls the audacity of the people doing it. Okay, so we've just walked through this entire argument. Let's just take a second to pull back and quickly recap the main points that the source uses to build its case for such a radical change. So the whole case really rests on these 6 pillars. You've got an economic system with debt that can't be paid and taxes that can't be understood. You've got government institutions that are basically frozen in place. A justice system it calls broken and unfair. A democratic process, it says, is fundamentally flawed. And then, tying it all together, is this idea of systemic, inevitable corruption. And that really brings us to the final question the source leaves you with. Its entire premise is that these massive problems aren't things you can just fix with a new law here or a new policy there. It's arguing the systems themselves are the problem. So after laying all this out, it forces you to wonder, if you accept that premise, if reform really is impossible, then what's the alternative? And that's a pretty heavy thought to end on.